Hi, I'm Cindy Cloward with Riley Blake Designs, and today I'm going to show you how to take a horizontal panel and make it into a vertical quilt using two coordinating borders. So our national parks panels have been so popular, and most of them are vertical prints, but we do have one that's a horizontal print. And the quilts we make are usually rectangle, meaning they're taller than they are wide. So you don't want a wide quilt that's short. And I'm going to show you how to take this panel and make a vertical quilt. And here's our two coordinating prints. So here we go. We've got this panel. Let me show you how it looks on a bolt. So when you go to the fabric store and order this panel, ask them to cut it out with scissors and not a rotary cutter. It's usually not printed perfectly straight on the fabric. Okay, so we are going to pull this way. And you notice my selvages are on side to side, so this is printed on its side. And it fills almost the full 42, 43 inches. So that's where you get the horizontal print. So when I'm cutting out my panels, I always like to use the border as my guide. Again, it's not always printed straight across. So I'm going to take my rotary cutter and I'm going to use this border dark brown line as my guide, and I'm going to cut it out 2 inches. And I am going to use my rotary cutter. So I am going to adjust my fabric a little bit. It's stretchable. And make sure I get it lined up just how I want it before I make my first rotary cut. Now once I've made that first cut, I'm going to pull it down like this. And adjust it ever so slightly so that bottom line, that bottom border is just lined up just right. And then I'm going to take my rotary cutter and cut the rest off just like that. I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing on the top. So your top and bottom have been lined up. Now I'm going to do my two sides, which are on the selvage. Now generally, stripes and lines on the selvage are a little more straight. And I've got about 1/2 inch to my selvage. That's very straight. So I am just going to go down just like that. And cut my full selvage. Flip it over to the opposite side and do the same thing. And this method can be used on any panel, because really you just want it so your eye sees the same even border on the top and bottom. Once you've got it cut to the right size, then you're going to start putting on your borders. So I usually fold this in half, make sure they line up well, and then you're going to measure the center of your quilt. Once I've done that, I measure it here to here. That's 35.5. Your measurements might be a little bit different. So make sure you have a little notepad and a pencil to write down your measurements, because as soon as you measure, you forget if you don't write it down. So that's 35.5. I have already pre-measured my border print. I'm just going to check that again. So that's 35.5. Actually, I'm going to just take a hair off of that. And remember, when you're sewing, so this is the selvage side, you have very little stretch on this side, but there's a lot of stretch from selvage to selvage. So you're going to have more stretch on your border fabric than you're going to have on your panel if the side is a selvage, and this is our selvage side. So I want to make sure that these are completely the right size, because this is not going to stretch a lot of. And then this is where I put on my borders. I mark in the middle where my halfway mark is. And I pressed it on this. So with right sides together, again, this is when you start putting on your borders, be mindful if your fabric is directional. And this is directional, so I'm going to have it face inwards. There we go. Make sure that. And a little tip, if by chance your borders, if you have a side that they're not perfectly square and you have to stretch your fabric because you want the same size border on both sides, it has a tiny, tiny bit of stretch. I put the fabric that needs to stretch slightly on the bottom, because if I try and sew it this way, this fabric tends to stretch a little more when it's underneath. So I put the fabric, in this case it's going to be this border print on the bottom when I stitch. Okay, we've sewed both our sides on. I'm going to give them a good press. Always press them the way they're facing first. Set those stitches in. And then I open them up. And I'm pressing my seam to the dark side. All right, once we've given that a good press, we take a look at our panel. Looks good. Now we are going to fold this in half and get our next measurement for the top and bottom border. I'm going to measure from the center. I'm going to pull that out right there. Make sure everything's lined up. Now that it's getting wider, I take a side measurement. I don't stretch it, but I pull it slightly when I measure this. And it's 25 inches. So we're going to make a 50-inch strip times 2 to put on our borders. And now you've noticed that we've done a 3.5 inch on each side, and I'm going to add 2 6-inch borders for the top and the bottom. And now that we have to have a width of 50 inches, we're going to have to piece our borders together. So you're going to need 3 to make 2 50-inch borders. So I've cut out 3 strips. I'm going to line them all up. Put them over. And when I do this, I piece together all 3 strips. Now, again, be mindful if your fabric is directional, that you don't flip one side one direction and the other way. So I'm going to grab my pin. I'm going to pin this border, sew it on. And I'm going to go sew my border together. Okay, once I've got this border all sewn together, one big long strip, I do press my seams open. So that's nicely pressed open. Now, these are each 25 inches. I've got extra fabric here, so I go a little bit over my 25. I make sure that's lined up. Nicely roll that. Okay, so now that that's 25 inches, I'm going to line that up, cut that. There's my extra. This is how I do it, a fast and furious border. I'm sure that's cut just how I want it, so I'm just going to lay that. And I cut my second border just like that. It's my extra. Just move that off there. I press those just like I did on the outside border for this top and bottom border. I press this too because I want to make sure my borders are centered. So I line that up. So that's the center. I do add a pin right so I know exactly where to center that. Again, be mindful the direction where this is going. This is just the right direction I want it to go. Right sides together, line that up. I'm going to pin it here. Now I'm going to pin my 2 sides and then put pins in between and sew my top and bottom border. I have sewn my top and bottom border and I'm ready to add my final borders around the quilt. Again, I'm going to add shorter borders on the side and a big border on the top and bottom. And it works with this quilt because the borders are fun, but really our focus and attention is on the center panel. So I'm going to add a 10-inch border on both sides of this quilt. And you can do the math. You've measured how big your panel is, and you've got 3.5 inches on both sides. But sometimes when I'm just doing a quick quilt, I will just do a quick measurement and cut out my borders like this. I measure from the center. Oh, and that is 5.5. So I'm adding another 50 times 2, and I'm going to hurry and cut out my borders. So here is 3 10-inch borders. I'm going to sew them together just like I did on my top and bottom piece, and then I'll put my borders on. I just put on my 2 side 10-inch borders, and so I've grown my quilt quite a lot. Now I need to put my top and bottom border, and to really grow this quilt, I'm going to show you how I do it because I'm using the full width of the fabric. Now, when you're measuring how big your border needs to be, again, you can do all the math because all the math is pretty easy once you've measured your center panel and then added on your 2 borders. But sometimes when I'm just putting together a quilt so quick and easy, I will just measure like this from the center. And again, I give it a slight pull, but I don't stretch my fabric. I write down my measurements. And times it by 2. And now I've already measured this fabric out to be the same width of my fabric for my top and bottom border, the same width of my quilt. And look what I'm going to do. I'm using the full width of this, cut in half for the top and bottom piece. What I mean is I'm going to cut off my selvages, and then I'm going to cut so I have 2 pieces of fabric. And now you have your 2 very big final borders. I've just added my giant borders to the top and bottom, and my quilt top is finished. Once you learn how to cut out your panel and add borders, you can grow your quilt as big as you want and in the direction you want. So it's just that easy to make a horizontal panel into this beautiful quilt.